Imagine a city so magnificent that its destruction haunted even those who destroyed it. Picture harbors so vast that 1,000 ships could anchor without crowding. Envision wealth so immense that Rome itself trembled with envy. This was Carthage, the jewel of the ancient Mediterranean, a civilization that rose from nothing to challenge the greatest empire the world had ever known. But here's the question that has tormented historians for over 2 millennia. Was Carthage always doomed to fall, or did a single moment, a single decision, seal the fate of an entire civilization? And what would have happened if Carthage had won the Punic Wars and Rome had been destroyed? You will find out in the next video. So subscribe now so you don't miss it. Today we peel back the layers of time to reveal a story of ambition, betrayal, and a hatred so profound it reshaped the ancient world. This is the tale of how 2 superpowers locked in mortal combat for over a century. Now only one would survive to write history. Our story begins not with war, but with purple. Yes, purple, the color of kings and emperors. 3,000 years ago, Phoenician traders discovered that certain sea snails along the Lebanese coast produced a dye so precious that gram for gram was worth more than gold. This purple dye became the foundation of an empire. The Phoenicians were master sailors, perhaps the greatest the ancient world had ever seen. They didn't conquer with swords, but with trade agreements. They didn't build walls, but harbors. And when their homeland came under threat from the expanding Assyrian Empire, they did what they did best. They sailed west. Beyond the edges of the known world, in 814 BCE, according to legend, Queen Dido fled her brother's murderous rage in Tyre and founded a new city on the North African coast. The locals agreed to give her as much land as could be covered by an ox hide. Clever Dido cut the hide into thin strips and encircled an entire hill. That hill became the Barca, the heart of Carthage, whether the legend is true or not. One fact remains: Carthage grew from a refugee settlement into the greatest commercial empire of the ancient Mediterranean. By the 6th century BCE, Carthaginian ships dominated trade routes from Britain to sub-Saharan Africa. They founded colonies across North Africa, Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily. Their explorers sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic, reaching as far as West Africa and possibly even the British Isles. But Carthage's greatest innovation wasn't their ships or their colonies. It was their approach to power itself. Unlike other ancient empires that relied on massive armies and direct control, Carthage built a network. It created the world's first true commercial empire, held together not by force, but by mutual profit. Local rulers kept their thrones. As long as they paid tribute and allowed Carthaginian merchants free access to their ports, it was imperialism by contract rather than conquest. The city itself became a wonder of the ancient world. The harbors of Carthage were an engineering marvel, a rectangular commercial port connected to a circular military harbor, with capacity for 220 warships. The military harbor center held an island where the admiral could observe the entire fleet, while remaining hidden from enemy spies. Surrounding the harbors rose temples to Baal-Hamon and Tanit, markets that sold goods from 3 continents, and residential quarters with multi-story apartment buildings that wouldn't look out of place in a modern city at its height. Carthage housed perhaps 700,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Its wealth was legendary. Carthaginian merchants traded in gold from Africa, silver from Spain, tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, silk from the Far East. They invented the industrial production of garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans would later adopt as their ketchup. They perfected agricultural techniques that made the North African coast the breadbasket, now the Mediterranean. But all this wealth and power created something else: enemies. It's the greatest of these. Enemies was growing stronger across the sea. Rome in the 3rd century BCE was not yet the marble-clad capital of empire we imagined. It was a rough, aggressive republic that had just finished conquering the Italian peninsula. Romans were farmers and soldiers, people who believed that virtue came from working the land and serving in the legions. To them, the merchant princes of Carthage represented everything corrupt and soft about the world. The first sparks of conflict came, inevitably over Sicily. The island was a patchwork of Greek cities, Carthaginian strongholds, and independent kingdoms. Both Rome and Carthage had interests there. Both had allies who called for aid. Neither trusted the other's intentions. The ancient historian Polybius puts it simply. The Romans feared that if Carthage controlled Sicily, they would use it as a springboard to invade Italy. The Carthaginians feared that if Rome took Sicily, their entire maritime empire would be threatened. Fear, more than hatred, started the First Punic War in 264 BCE. What followed was 23 years of grinding conflict that transformed both civilizations. Rome, which had never fought a naval battle, built a fleet from scratch. They copied a captured Carthaginian warship, adding their own innovation, the Corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into floating land combat. The war's climax came at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, the Roman fleet, financed by private citizens when the state treasury ran empty, smashed the last Carthaginian naval force. Carthage, exhausted and facing rebellion among its mercenaries, sued for peace. The terms were harsh: evacuation of Sicily, massive indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver, and the humiliation of defeat. But in that moment of Carthage's darkest hour, something happened that would echo through history. Hamilcar Barca, Carthage's most brilliant general, took his 9-year-old son to the temple of Baal-Hamon. There, before the sacred flames, he made the boy swear an oath. The exact words are lost to history, but their meaning was clear, eternal. Enmity toward Rome. That boy was Hannibal Barca, and that oath would drench the Mediterranean in blood. Can you imagine what it must have been like for young Hannibal? Growing up in the shadow of defeat, listening to his father's stories of battles that could have been won, of a war lost not on the battlefield but at the negotiating table, he spent his youth in Spain, where his father carved out a new empire. For Carthage, among the Iberian tribes, he learned languages, studied Greek military texts, observed Roman tactics, but most of all, he nursed that childhood oath like a sacred flame. When Hannibal took command of Carthaginian forces in Spain at age 26, he was ready. His plan was audacious beyond belief. He would take the war to Rome's doorstep, not by sea, where Rome now matched Carthage, but by land, through Gaul and over the Alps. The Second Punic War began in 218 BCE with an act of calculated provocation. Hannibal besieged Saguntum, a Spanish city allied to Rome. When Roman ambassadors demanded he stop, he ignored them. When Rome declared war, Hannibal was already marching north with an army of 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Crossing of the Alps remains one of history's most incredible military achievements. Hannibal chose the most difficult route precisely because it was unexpected. His army faced not just frozen passes and hostile mountain tribes, but the psychological terror of the unknown. Elephants, creatures of the African plains, struggled through snow and ice. Men who had never seen mountains found themselves traversing paths where a single misstep meant death. The Roman historian Livy describes scenes of unimaginable hardship: soldiers chipping through ice-covered rocks, heating them with fire, and then dousing them with vinegar to crack them apart. Elephants sliding on frozen paths, their handlers desperately trying to calm the terrified beasts. Men sleeping, standing up because lying down in the snow meant never waking again. Half the army died in those mountains. But those who survived emerged from the Alps like demons from Roman nightmares. And Hannibal, now one-eyed after an infection, claimed his sight, prepared to unleash hell upon Rome. The battles that followed read like a manual of military genius. At the Trebia River, Hannibal used the Romans' aggressive confidence against them, luring them across an icy stream to fight on ground of his choosing. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed an entire Roman army in morning fog, slaughtering 15,000 in 3 hours. But these were merely rehearsals for his masterpiece. Cannae, August 2nd, 216 BCE. The temperature soared under the southern Italian sun. Rome had assembled its largest army ever, 80,000 men, determined to crush Hannibal through sheer weight of numbers. The Carthaginian force numbered barely 40,000. Roman confidence was absolute. Their defeat would be total. Hannibal arranged his troops in a convex formation, with weak Spanish and Gallic infantry at the center and his veteran African troops hidden on the flanks. As the massive Roman formation advanced, Hannibal's center gradually gave ground, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into what they believed was victory. Then the trap snapped shut. The African infantry wheeled inward from both flanks. The Carthaginian cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, smashed into the Roman rear. In minutes, 70,000 Roman soldiers found themselves compressed into a space where they could barely move, let alone fight. The killing lasted until sunset. Rome lost more men in a single day than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. In Rome, panic reached levels not seen since the Gallic sack 2 centuries earlier. Citizens performed human sacrifice, burying alive to Greeks and to Gauls in the Forum. The Senate ordered that the words defeat and loss not be spoken in public. Mothers were forbidden to mourn their sons in the streets. Some senators proposed abandoning Italy entirely, and this is where our story takes its strangest turn. Hannibal, standing among the corpses of Rome's greatest army, made a decision that historians still debate. He did not march on Rome. His officers begged him. Hannibal, his cavalry commander, supposedly said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use one." But Hannibal hesitated. Perhaps he lacked siege equipment. Perhaps he believed Rome's allies would abandon her after such defeats. Perhaps, having seen so much death, something in him recoiled from delivering the final blow. Whatever the reason, it gave Rome time. And Rome used that time to produce something unprecedented in ancient warfare: a strategy of not fighting. Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator, understood what others didn't. You don't defeat Hannibal by fighting Hannibal. You defeat him by denying him the victories he needs to sustain his polyglot army. For 14 years, Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy. He won every battle, but slowly lost the war. Rome's Italian allies, bound by centuries of shared citizenship and culture, mostly stayed loyal. Meanwhile, Roman armies conquered Spain, cutting off Hannibal's reinforcements. When his brother Hasdrubal finally crossed the Alps with a relief force, Roman armies intercepted and destroyed him, throwing his severed head into Hannibal's camp. The end came not in Italy, but in Africa. Scipio Africanus, who had studied Hannibal's tactics like a devoted student, invaded Carthage's homeland. The city that had sent Hannibal to destroy Rome now recalled him to save Carthage. At Zama in 202 BCE, student faced teacher. This time, it was Scipio who executed the perfect battle, using Hannibal's own tactics against him. The undefeatable was defeated. But even in victory, Rome couldn't rest easy. Carthage, stripped of its empire and burdened with crushing indemnities, did what it had always done best: it traded. Within a generation, the city was prosperous again. Carthaginian merchants once more competed with Roman traders across the Mediterranean. The defeated enemy was rising from the ashes. In Rome, one man became obsessed with this resurrection. Marcus Porcius Cato, who had fought in the Second Punic War, saw Carthaginian recovery not as admirable, but as ominous. He began ending every speech in the Senate, whether about aqueducts or agriculture, with the same phrase, "Carthago delinda est." Carthage must be destroyed. Think about the psychology of this moment. Rome had won, was now the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Yet the very existence of Carthage, prosperous and peaceful, seemed to mock that victory. The trauma of Hannibal's invasion had scarred the Roman psyche so deeply that they could not tolerate their former enemy's survival, even as a defanged trading partner. The Third Punic War was not a war, but a murder. When Rome finally moved in 149 BCE, their demands were designed to be impossible. First, Carthage must surrender all weapons. They complied. Then, all armor. They complied. Finally, the ultimatum: abandon your city and move 10 miles inland. For a people whose identity was tied to the sea, it was a death sentence. the Carthaginians chose to fight. What followed was 3 years of desperate resistance that would move even Roman historians to admiration. With no weapons, they turned their city into an arsenal. Women cut their hair to make rope for catapults. Smiths worked day and night forging swords from melted statues. Even slaves were freed and armed, fighting alongside their former masters. When the walls finally fell in 146 BCE, the battle became a horror. Roman soldiers fought house to house against civilians who preferred death to slavery. The wife of Hasdrubal, the Boetharch, standing on the burning temple of Eshmon with her children, cursed her husband for negotiating surrender, and threw herself and her children into the flames. Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman general and grandson of Hannibal's conqueror, watched the city burn and wept. Polybius, the Greek historian at his side, records that Scipio quoted Homer, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish." He understood that in destroying Carthage, Rome had crossed a line from which there was no return. The destruction was methodical and complete. The city burned for 17 days. The surviving population, perhaps 50,000 out of 500,000, was sold into slavery. The harbor that had sheltered 1,000 ships was demolished stone by stone. Where one of humanity's greatest cities had stood, nothing remained but rubble and ash. Legend says the Romans sowed the ground with salt, but this is likely myth. The land was too valuable for agriculture. Instead, Rome did something perhaps worse. They erased Carthage from memory. Libraries were burned or given to African princes. The Punic language was suppressed. Within a generation, one of humanity's great civilizations had been reduced to a cautionary tale. But ghosts have a way of haunting their murderers. The wealth Rome seized from Carthage corroded the Republic's institutions. The professional armies that had defeated Hannibal became tools for ambitious generals to seize power. The total war that Rome had learned from its struggle with Carthage would eventually tear the Republic apart in civil conflicts. More profoundly, the destruction of Carthage marked a turning point in human history. It established the principle that victory could mean not just defeating an enemy, but erasing them from existence. It's no coincidence that the century following Carthage's fall saw Rome transform from a republic into an empire, from a state governed by law into one ruled by force. Today, archaeologists working in Tunisia find layers of ash 3 feet deep in some places, testament to the thoroughness of Roman destruction. They've recovered children's toys fused by heat, household goods melted together, the detritus of lives ended in flame. Each artifact is a whisper from the dead, a reminder of what total war really means. Modern Tunis sits atop ancient Carthage, a living city built on the bones of the dead. The harbor that once sheltered Carthaginian warships now hosts pleasure boats and fishing vessels. Tourists take selfies where Hannibal once swore his oath of hatred. Life as it always does has returned. But the lessons remain. What can we learn from this ancient tragedy? Perhaps that hatred, nursed through generations, becomes a poison that destroys both hater and hated. Perhaps that economic competition, left unchecked, can spiral into existential conflict. Or perhaps simply that power, absolute power, corrupts absolutely. And that in destroying your enemy completely, you risk destroying your own humanity. As we face our own global challenges, with superpowers eyeing each other across digital divides instead of the Mediterranean Sea, the story of Carthage whispers its warnings. Trade wars can become real wars. Economic rivalry can transform into existential hatred. And the logic of total victory, of Delinda Est, leads nowhere but to the ash heap of history. Do you think Carthage could have survived if Hannibal had marched on Rome after Cannae? Or was the conflict between these two powers inevitable, written into the very nature of their opposing systems? When we look at our modern world, with its competing powers and ideologies, are we seeing the same patterns that drove Rome and Carthage to mutual destruction? The Mediterranean still laps at the shores where Carthaginian children once played. The same stars that guided Phoenician navigators shine down on the ruins of their civilization. And somewhere in those ruins, in the ash layers and fused glass, in the scattered coins bearing the image of Tenet, lies a truth as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago, In seeking to destroy your enemy completely, you may succeed only in destroying what makes you worth preserving. Remember Carthage, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of what humanity loses when fear triumphs over wisdom. When the logic of total war replaces the possibility of coexistence. For in the end, Rome's greatest victory may have been its greatest defeat, and the ghost of Carthage haunts us still, spurring through the centuries. You can destroy a city, you can erase a people, but you cannot kill the questions their absence leaves behind. The ruins remain silent, but their silence speaks volumes to those who dare to listen.